joining us today for a conversation about the death penalty in the United States. I want to preface it first by kind of situating the death penalty in the broader story of our criminal justice system, and even within COVID. As many of you are highly aware, the United States is one of the great incarcerators in the world. We are a nation that has built, for years people talked about a military industrial complex. We have that prison industrial complex in this nation. Tens and hundreds of thousands of people are incarcerated, and industries have built up around them that support that incarceration and that provide the political infrastructure to support continued efforts around policing and incarceration. So that is not primarily what I'm going to talk about today, but I do think it's important to situate as a starting point that the death penalty lives within a series of political and moral choices that the United States has made. And amongst those choices is the death penalty. Now, the number of people who are affected by an actual implemented death sentence is, relatively speaking, small. This year, 17 people have been executed, and that is 17 lost lives, and there's nothing small about that on an individual level. But when we think about how COVID has torn through the American prison system, there is so much more than just the death penalty going on in the criminal justice world. Nonetheless, I think it's incredibly important to spend a little time talking about the death penalty, because the death penalty, first of all, delivers the ultimate sanction to individual people. It's also incredibly important in many cases to the families of victims. And as a social issue, it's a third rail. It's a hugely important issue to many people in the polity. So I think it's an important topic to talk about, to see where it's sitting, to frame it, and then to hear what some of you think and what some of you are contemplating around this issue. First of all, I want to just briefly situate my experience with the death penalty. My first experience in criminal law was not with the death penalty. My first experience actually was in law school doing a criminal defense clinic. And I had an opportunity to work over a couple of summers as a law student on some death penalty cases pro bono with law firms that were assisting individuals facing death. But I did not actually start working on death penalty cases themselves until I became a professor at the University of Alabama, and I created a capital litigation defense clinic, a clinic that represented two different groups of people. And these two different groups of people are really the two different significant populations in America today who are facing down the death penalty. The first population that our clinic represented, and this is a group of people who are constantly moving through the system, were people who faced the death sentence but had not yet gone to trial, had not yet been convicted or been given a death sentence. And in states like Alabama, where I was, this is a pretty routine part of the criminal justice system. In a very significant number of cases involving intentional murder, the state will seek death. It is not an extraordinary remedy. It is an ordinary remedy in murder cases for a number of states, particularly in the Midwest and the South. So we represented people who might see a possibility of a death sentence, and we were working with other lawyers hoping to prevent that. The second population of people who are facing death are those who have been found guilty and sentenced to death in almost, but not every state, in almost every state by a jury. And those people have other opportunities to challenge those death sentences, and they take advantage of those. These are called, first of all, there's the direct appeal, and then there are collateral challenges. That is, even after a person's been convicted, sentenced, and finished their direct appeals, there are other opportunities. I can talk a little bit more in the questions if you have questions about what that collateral process looks like. So we represented individuals facing death at that time, and we saw some amazing cases. And one of our cases involved a person who was 17 years old when he committed the murder. At one time, when we took that case, it was still constitutional to execute a person who committed murder as a child. That is no longer constitutional. I also served as the chair of the ABA's Death Penalty Assessment Task Force, where we looked to see whether Alabama's death penalty felt like it was in line with the legal requirements for legitimate application of the death penalty. And we actually called for a moratorium because there were significant questions about whether Alabama was achieving that. That moratorium was not adopted by the state, but our report was cited by the US Supreme Court by Justice Kennedy. I then later served on a Pennsylvania committee that did a similar job of assessing the efficacy or appropriateness of the death penalty in Pennsylvania. So there's a little background. What I want to do is start, for those of you who haven't thought a lot about the death penalty, I want to start by talking a little bit about what the legitimate reasons are, what the courts see as legitimate reasons to impose the death penalty. And I want to start by conceding that for many Americans, and in fact, many people around the world, the death penalty is per se illegitimate. And the reason for that is a moral one. And it's this question of whether the state, the government, ought to engage in the premeditated killing of a human being. This is a complicated moral debate. There are some people who think the state should never kill, but of course there are wars, and sometimes many of us think they're necessary wars, and people do die. And so the question of whether the state has the authority and the right to kill is a complicated one. But many people think the death penalty is different because the death penalty involves a long planned killing of a person who, if carefully treated, may present no risk to any person in the future. So it presents a difficult moral question. I'm going to set that aside, and each of you may have your own views on it, and our president-elect, I think, has some views on that. And it would be the traditional expectation that other Catholics, like the president, would share that view. And it's part of a sort of the stated pro-life view of the Catholic Church. Interestingly enough, the justices on the Supreme Court who support the death penalty are in all but one case Catholic. So people don't all follow religious lines on that. But the legitimate reasons for the death penalty that courts recognize are really two. And anyone who has taken criminal law knows this, and any of you who hope to take criminal law will surely learn this, that the two legitimate bases for this punishment are, first of all, deterrence. Courts and states are permitted to impose sentences for the purpose of causing others to behave better in the future, to deter future crimes, to deter future murders. The story of this, if it works, if it's true, would be a person who's thinking of committing a homicide might stop and think to themselves, oh, if I do this, if I commit this act, I might be executed. And therefore, I won't commit the act. I will be deterred because I'm too scared of the possibility that I might be executed if I commit murder. So that's one legitimate, and I say legitimate as in the sense the courts have validated, one legitimate reason. There's a ton of evidence that's conflicting on the subject. There's some data that suggests that the death penalty might deter killings. There's other data that suggests it doesn't. For me, there's a real common sense question here, which is, I could see the death penalty deterring murder for hire, for example, killings that are really premeditated, but so many murders, almost all murders, are not like that. And you really might, the common sense question is, does a person who gets really angry, gets really upset, makes a call in a few seconds or even a minute, does that person really run the almost economist's calculus of, I'd like to kill the person, but I don't want to risk the death penalty, so I won't do it. I'm skeptical, but I'm open to the possibility that there is research on it. The other legitimate reason for the death penalty, according to the courts, is something called retribution. That is, you're allowed to give just desserts. A person who killed is entitled to have justice meted upon him or her. These are the legitimate reasons the courts have recognized. They have never authorized the imposition of death in recent years on the basis of race or religion. And courts will never explicitly do that, even though there has been significant research that suggests race does matter, and particularly the race of the victim matters. Studies suggest that. I would also like to point out that there are a couple of other things that go on in the sentence of death, which I think are deeply troubling. One of them is the imposition of death as a way of signaling politics. I think this is kind of appalling. So one of the studies that we've seen shows that in election years, judges in some states, at least, judges who are up for election, are more likely to impose death in an election year. Think about that. The death penalty is supposed to be about the person who committed the bad act. But when they're being imposed for the political gain of a judge, or when it's being sought for the political gain of a prosecutor, that's a really complicated basis for imposing death. There's something else going on right now in the country, which some of you may have seen, which is that the federal government is on a death penalty spree. The United States government has a death penalty. It has used it very sparingly, and it hadn't been used in a couple of decades before the Trump administration. But in this year, there have been a total of 17 executions thus far, 5 states and the federal government. And shockingly, of those 17, 10 were done by the federal government. So this administration has been passionate about it, but it just hasn't just been passionate now. It is pursuing a lame duck presidency execution agenda. Already, at least 2 people, maybe 3, have been executed since the election. And there are plans to execute 3 more people over the next couple of weeks before Joe Biden, who does not support the death penalty, comes to office. There is a hurry to execute people. And I think that presents those kinds of moral questions. That presents the question of whether it's legitimate to choose the ordering of death. It's legitimate to accelerate death so that you get to do it politically. But that's what's happened. And one of those people, if it all goes off, will be Lisa Montgomery. Lisa Montgomery will be the first woman executed by the federal government in decades. I will tell you, there hasn't been a lame duck execution, that is, an execution after the election of a person leaving office. There hasn't been one since the 19th century. So this is a very exceptional circumstance. But I think Lisa Montgomery, that case captures the ways people feel deep unease about the death penalty. Lisa Montgomery received a death sentence for a gruesome murder, a horrific murder, but the kind of murder that I think makes many people wonder, is this really a person who has their full capacity, who made choices rationally? So going back to that idea of deterrence, is Lisa Montgomery a person who was deterrable? This is what she did. She had mental illness. No question she had mental illness. And in prison, she is being treated with a cocktail of mental health drugs. She believed she was pregnant, then she was faking pregnancy, and then she found a woman who was 8 months pregnant. This is horrendous. And she strangled her, and she cut the baby out of her belly, and she took the baby home to begin taking care of it as her own. That's a horrendous murder. It's a horrendous set of facts. And nobody thinks that a person like that is not culpable for what she did. But when you stop and think about how many people you know, people that you see as people of sound mind, who would do that act, I think that taps into this instinct, which I think we rightly have, which is a worry that the person who's committing most of these homicides that are facing death isn't a person who is of fully sound mind. And there is data, including a study of the brains of a number of people who've been executed, done a number of years ago, that suggests that the overwhelming majority of people who receive the death penalty are suffering from mental disabilities, which is why I think one of the great untold stories of the death penalty is not just that it is racist, but it is systematically imposed upon people with disabilities at radically higher rates than the general population. And I suspect that over time, when we stare down the moral issues, that issue will become clearer and clearer, because as we get better and better technology, we're more and more able to see into the brains of people who have these mental illnesses. So they don't just seem like flimsy excuses, they actually have material reality. And here's the thing. That data was available in the case of Lisa Montgomery. There was an MRI, maybe a PET scan, and it was excluded at trial for reasons having to do with claims of credibility. But I think the world is changing, and I think that's one of the ways. As I see it, there are three core challenges to the death penalty and its appropriateness. The first I talked about is the morality question. The second is the bias question, whether it's race bias or bias against people with disabilities. It seems to me, and I think most people, that the bias we see in any system, and our justice system is absolutely infected, has much deeper and more serious consequences when that bias yields a death. That is, if we are going to say that a state is entitled to kill, that it's entitled to kill with premeditation and planning, I would think we would want to be incredibly, incredibly certain that inappropriate prejudices did not infect that decision. Unfortunately, the data suggests the contrary. It suggests that there is bias all through the system, that bias starts at the point of prosecutorial decisions seeking death, and that bias infects jury decision-making all the way through to the death penalty and the death imposition. I think the other problem in death cases, something you may have heard about, is the inadequacy of counsel. I worked at a large firm for a couple of years, and I know the resources that get invested in helping make sure Bank of America and Wells Fargo are able to keep their money, avoid investigation, avoid prosecution. I know the amount of money that Microsoft and Facebook and Google spend to avoid regulation. The numbers are immense. And from my instincts in practicing law, what I would say is money is important. The death of a person is weightier. But if you look at allocation of resources, it's quite the opposite. The kinds of resources we allocate to the average death penalty case at the state level, at least pre-conviction, looks like the kind of resources you would assign to an auto accident, where, maybe $100,000 was in play. Like, say a really nice car gets destroyed in an accident. I don't think these cases are nice car cases. And I think that's one of the questions that a lot of people wonder about and they worry about. So the question becomes, where are we today? What's the arc of the death penalty in the United States? The death penalty is definitely in less use than it was in earlier periods, and relatively fewer states impose it. The majority of states still have it on the books, but it's not imposed in most states. There is growing discomfort with it in surveys, but to be honest, that's cyclical. I think that comfort with the death penalty kind of goes in line with comfort with our criminal justice system, and we're not that comfortable with it right now. And I think that's probably good news to increase the scrutiny of the death penalty. So the most effective way to eliminate death penalty in a state is for the legislature to vote it out. The problem is that's hard to do. When you have death penalty on the books, there are a lot of people who have a lot of worries that they'll get knocked out of office. The death penalty has proven to be a very effective tool for elections, not just for judges, but for legislators. the way the death penalty is imposed is that statutes have what are known as aggravating factors that can cause a jury to impose death. So it's not just a murder, but a murder with an additional circumstance. And many legislatures have found lots of ways to reach out to constituents. Kill a school teacher, that's an aggravating factor. Reach out to this constituency. Kill a postal worker, that's an aggravating factor. And so the politics are difficult. Another way in which the death penalty either can be eliminated or narrowed is through the courts. And the courts that we had up until a couple years ago with Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court had a tolerant but limiting view of the death penalty, having narrowed its application and having demanded far better lawyering than ever before. So that has already made fewer cases reach the death stage. And then there are other activities, like the ones I was involved in with commissions that are designed to bring scrutiny and to bring conversations like this conversation to the fore. So before I stop, I want to tell you why this is a really important conversation to me, why I want to always have these conversations. It's because the death penalty is actually one of the significant issues of our time, notwithstanding the fact that not that many people are actually executed, going back to where I started. It is important symbolically. It's important symbolically in part because it's a claim about just how good our justice system is. By having a death penalty, we're saying we're that fair, we're that just, we're that accurate, that we think you can put life or death on it. And I have significant questions about that. And so I think that the political argument is a little bit about whether we're that confident, that cocky about our justice system, that we think life or death can reasonably lean on it. I also think it's very important because I think it's an important conversation to continue over time, because these moral questions are themselves really difficult. And the more we treat the death penalty as kind of just a checkoff box on a list of issues that tell you which team you're on politically, the less we're standing up on the job of one of the essential things for society, which is establishing our moral baseline. And I'm of this view, that the United States has been a beacon around many issues of morality in the world, maybe not as much in the last few years. But the death penalty is one of those places where we turn out to be not a leader. And while we do have a much more rigorous death penalty review system than other countries, many countries that have death don't. When you see that recent execution in Iran, I'm sure many people, which was of a leading opponent of the country who had been lured to Iraq from France and was executed last week, we have much less moral authority over countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and many others if we don't have our own house in order. So I think it's really important to have these conversations. And I'm excited to have all of you here because it's an opportunity for you to learn more, to think out loud, ask questions, and to share with each other.